Welcome back, everyone. Time for another reaction video. Well, today we're going to go back to the channel, The Time Travel Artist. It's a relatively small channel at the moment. Hopefully that changes and they grow. He's got some really unique ways of looking at history, though. What they do is they basically take images, video, pictures, paintings, things like that from time, and he merges them together on a timeline with kind of a time-lapse thing to show what those things look like over time. So in this case today, we're going to take a look at the White House, which if you're not from the States and you're not familiar with it, I'm guessing most people are. It's where the American president lives and works, along with much of his administration. And we'll talk about a little bit about that as we get into things. So from 2020, going backward to 1800, we're going to take a look at the history of the White House. And I'll probably pause and talk a little bit about some things, make some observations about what's going on as we go about this. Link is in the description to the original content. Would definitely welcome you checking them out. I've done one or two of their videos before, but it's a great mix of American history, a lot of things to do with like cities in the UK, like Glasgow and Hull and London, places like that. So I'm guessing they're probably British, but I don't know that for sure. But definitely worth your time. Check them out. Links in the description. Let's go ahead and dive into this one. So looking at an overview of Washington, D.C. So for those who may not be familiar with the history of the U.S., it's called Washington, D.C. because D.C. stands for District of Columbia. When the plan was decided, and let me back way up here, the first capital of the United States after we adopted a constitution was New York City. That was where George Washington is sworn in as first president of the United States. Federal Hall is right down in Manhattan there. And they were there for a little while, but it was never meant to be permanent. There's something called the dinner table compromise that takes place. It's kind of this fabled thing that is talked about in the song The Room Where It Happens in the musical Hamilton, where Alexander Hamilton, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson, who is the Secretary of State, and James Madison, who is a member of Congress at this time, get together and basically they're hashing out a plan. Hamilton's trying to get this debt assumption plan passed, where the federal government would assume the debts of all the states. It would accumulate more power for the federal government, but it would help the government to establish national credit with other nations. So it's an important step in prosperity for the U.S., but folks like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who are opposed to a strong central federal government, don't like the idea. But they're trying to figure out where they're going to put the capital. And so Hamilton says he'll get some of his people to support the idea of the capital being along the Potomac River in Maryland and Virginia, which would be close to home for Virginians like Madison and Jefferson, in exchange for getting Madison to help try and push the plan through Congress for the debt plan. So they end up picking this spot on the Potomac that's actually really super close to George Washington's home in Mount Vernon. And it is carved out as this square area called the District of Columbia, so that it won't be in a state, but would rather be a federal district. Half of it's carved out of Virginia and half of it's carved out of Maryland. Well, over time, the part that was carved out of Virginia was eventually given back to Virginia. And so today, D.C. is only the part that is carved out of Maryland. The part that was carved out of Virginia is now Alexandria, in that area, where Arlington National Cemetery is. So Arlington's there as well. So D.C. is the District of Columbia. Washington is the city in D.C. where the capital is. There's a couple of other cities there. Georgetown's in D.C., for example. So that was a long explanation, I know. So we're looking at 2020 now. So this is the population of D.C. A lot of folks live in the suburbs, but a lot of the people who work in downtown, like that work for the government, live in places like Rockville, Maryland, Northern Virginia, places like that. This area here is called the Ellipse.
To carry out the orderly and peaceful transfer of power.
So we're seeing who was president during these different times with these images. And look how much the population of DC has changed. Just in the last 15, 20 years, it's gone from 600,000 to over 700,000. It's a big swing.
We face hard decisions about peace and war.
National Christmas tree right there. So the road that is on the far side of the White House from where we're looking is closed off. You can't drive on it anymore. But like Blair House is right there, and you can walk. That's where you can get a really close look at the White House, because from this side, the closest you can get to the White House is right out here on this street here. And it's interesting now to see that there were baseball fields on the ellipse back in the day. I didn't realize that. And when you look at these two wings here, these were added on later. This is the west wing right here of the White House on the left. So we're looking north. This is south toward us. East wing's over here. The west wing is actually where the Oval Office is. It is not in the original part of the White House, which is the residence.
We can bring together the
second,
resources of this nation and the spirit of the American people.
For every generation,
So now population back in 1965 is actually higher than it is today. So there must have been a kind of a big change
a destiny.
over time in population.
Each of us playing an honorable.
So they skip over Truman there, but during Truman's administration and the aftermath of World War II, the entire inside of the main building of the White House was gutted. I mean, like completely gutted to where like there were no floors, nothing but the outside walls were left. So anything if you go into the White House now and you see it and you see like the Lincoln bedroom, understand that's been rebuilt since Lincoln was there. It's been all rebuilt. Now they preserved a lot of that stuff so they could put it back in, but the bones of the house are all that are original, really.
In the great struggle to save our democratic civilization.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. It is our duty.
At least we skipped by him pretty fast. So you can see the West Wing's still there, East Wing's still there. We're getting pretty close to the time when those were constructed. Pretty cool that we have these shots of the White House from up that high. 1911. I'm not going to get too much more of that. I'm guessing these are probably views from the Washington Monument, because this is about where the Washington Monument is in relation to the White House.
I believe again that the American people are as a whole capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes.
Look at how quickly the population changed. 1900, it's 282,000. 611,000 37 years later. It tripled in that span of time. That's crazy. So now we're going to McKinley's administration. Now you don't have the West and East wings. I believe those were built, was that during Roosevelt's administration? So this is kind of what it looks like today. It was during Roosevelt's administration that the expansions took place. The Oval Office over here in the West Wing was placed there during Taft's administration. There was an electrical fire that gutted a lot of it in the 1920s, I think it was. But pretty much the White House complex as we know it today came into being between 1900 and 1910 for the most part. So this is McKinley's turn. Now we're going back to Grover Cleveland. So now we're into the beginning of Andrew Johnson's administration. Population of D.C. at this point is 100,000, which is still a pretty good-sized city for the 1860s, when the population of the U.S. is about a tenth of what it is today. Maybe a ninth, something like that. But this was a time when people could still kind of walk up to the White House. Remember, Secret Service protection for the president doesn't begin until after McKinley is assassinated in 1901. It was the third time a president was murdered in a span of 36 years. So they kind of knew they had to do something. So until that point, security at the White House is not quite what it is today. But again, you can see the outside of the building, for the most part, hasn't changed a whole lot. We're all the way back now to Andrew Jackson's administration, and you see the crowds of people there that are kind of in there. And you can see there's a little bit, I don't know the history of this particular structure here, what's going on. But now we're getting back to the point where the White House was burned. There you go. So the White House is burned in 1814 during the War of 1812. There was a battle outside of Washington, D.C. In Maryland. It was called the Battle of Bladensburg. It was one of the most important battles of the war, one of the biggest battles of the war. Madison was actually on the field with the Army during that battle. Whether he actually led troops in the field is another question. But Washington, D.C. was burned. And remember, at this point, D.C. is like not even 2 decades old. The White House, the first president to occupy the White House was John Adams, and it was in the final months of his administration. So Thomas Jefferson is the first guy to live in the White House for his entire time as president. And in that time, it was still being built. There's some really cool scenes of what the White House looked like at that time in the TV series John Adams. It's pretty cool to kind of see it. Built using a lot of slave labor, as was much of D.C., but it was burned, and you can see the scorch marks from the fire. If you've ever seen a building that's been burned, you know what those look like with the black above the windows. And so the whole thing was painted white. And it was after that point that people kind of started referring to it as the White House. It was always known up until much more recent times as the Executive Mansion. But now I think the stationery actually says the White House. There's the burning. So now you see, before it was burned, it had a very different roof on it. So this is really when it changes appearance big time, because now it doesn't have those kind of front columns and everything that we know. So, go back here, you see that very familiar looking kind of porch with the columns. None of that was there originally. That comes about closer to, you see Jackson's administration there. So we've got the burning, and then you've got a very different looking roof. 1800, that's when it's really 8,000 people already in D.C., which is impressive for a brand new city at that point. Saturday, November 1st, John Adams. So this is literally, because he's only president until March. At that time, the inauguration took place in March. So March of 1801 is when he vacates. So November, December, January, February, March. He's only in there for 4 or 5 months. So now we're going forward again. I guess we're just going to watch the whole thing unfold quickly. Pretty cool. It's a pretty cool way to see history unfold. I'm curious to know what the catalyst was for the population going down the way it did, because you can see it steadily climbing. Until I think the 60s. It climbed a lot after World War I. Up to 500,000. I mean, right there, almost 100 years ago, the population of D.C. is the same as what it is now. Gets up to 700,000 in 1946 after World War II. Looks like it peaks at about 760, and then during Johnson's administration starts going back down. So I don't know, because D.C. has a very heavy African-American population. So I'm curious, and maybe some of you are more familiar with this. Let me know in the comment section below. I'm curious if, because knowing what was going on in the 60s with the civil rights movement and everything, if that had something to do with it. Goes down by, 150,000? And then starts climbing again. Pretty interesting. Yeah, so just to give you a sense of some of the stuff, they do people as well. So John F. Kennedy, A Life Through Time. So they show like famous people and show them aging over time. They do some family tree type stuff with the ancestors of Elizabeth I through time, chancellors of Germany, prime ministers of Australia, A Life Through compilation going from Queen Victoria to Charles III. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. Check out some of it. If there's a particular video that they've done that you'd like to see me review on this channel and kind of break down and talk a little more about, let me know in the comment section below. And as I said, check it out through the link. Thanks for watching.